Greetings. Do you want to attack several times a second? Do you want to spam Wolfpack like 99% of other Berserker builds? Do you want to casually do over 1,000,000 damage just because it's funny? If you said yes to all of that, this is the build for you. So, before I showcase the build, let's first get the history of it out of the way. As you might know, my greatest contribution to the Torchlight II community is the brainless Berserker build. In the spirit of that, I basically tried to make similar-ish builds for the other classes, starting with a very rushed execution of an engineer build I will eventually rework a slight bit. Next up, I tried making an Outlander build, but I gave up at around level 40, and now we are here at the subject of our video. It started out as a variant of the brainless Berserker because I was just curious what it would be like with claws. Except while I was looking for inspiration for the previously mentioned Outlander build, I came across this Baguette boy and his Outlander build, which has a primary weapon enchanted for raw damage. Like, as it turns out, it's more worth it to enchant a weapon with elemental damage rather than with 200-ish strength. Huh, that's nice to know. Now, what's that other weapon? Holy shit, this is genius. So, a shout out to this French mastermind who taught me how to make a good DPS build. Anyway, let's rush through the progression part of the video. It's essentially the same as in the brainless Berserker, except you are not limited to passives. Get the True North set, get some enchanted weapons, and you will have a relatively easy time grinding. Get the necessary stats to equip the 2 Harbinger/Drake Talon rings, enchanted for strength, and a temporary necklace enchanted mostly for dexterity. That way you can get the stats to equip the rest of the Harbinger/Drake Talon set. Get these scrolls while we are at it, though the blocking one is not really necessary, but it's nice to have for sure. Now, let's talk about the armor. It's essentially the exact same as on the second version of the brainless Berserker. Though I didn't make a separate showcase video of it, I just briefly mentioned my intentions of making it in the brainless Berserker video. It's the version that uses 2 Cerulean Nightmares and the Hand of Orlok, as opposed to the Final Embrace and the Drake Talon gloves the showcased version of the build used. And similarly to that video, I instruct you to replace the Dexterity necklace to a Strength necklace once you have the raw stats to keep the rest of the armor on. And yes, I kinda expect you to have already seen the brainless Berserker build video. As I said, it's my greatest contribution to the Torchlight community and is basically the ancient caveman ancestor of my more refined builds, like this one. So, here they are. Now, let's talk about the weapons separately because they need a bit of explanation. My primary weapon is the Clockmaster's Tooth. At first you might see the damage numbers and just disregard it. However, this is where the secretly most important stat comes in, the attack rate. 0.40 is ridiculous, downright absurd. That means if you add a couple damage gems and some damage enchantments, you get the single highest DPS weapon. And since you have an extra multiplier on your ice damage, it's even better. My secondary weapon is the Netherrealm Claw, mostly for extra gem slots for attack speed and some extra stats for equipping the primary weapon. And now we come to the reason why the build is called 100,000 IQ Berserker. it has 100,000 DPS on the primary weapon. Well, technically it doesn't, as you can see, but if I trade some of my health gems in my armor for more Levantine schools, which give me strength, I can cross this arbitrary number at the cost of my survivability for no significant gain to my damage output. So yeah, I lied, this build is only 96,000 IQ. And you might be curious about why I chose this weapon setup, and it's actually rather simple. The game uses your primary weapon as the base for your skills that use weapon DPS to calculate their damage output. Now, the thing is, it's rather obvious what weapon is the baseline DPS that the game uses when you are equipping a two-handed weapon. However, when it comes to two one-handed weapons simultaneously, it's probably not obvious to all of you, but it's the right-hand weapon that gets calculated into the equation. So this is why my primary weapon is built for damage, while my secondary weapon is built for basically complementing that damage by increasing the attack rate. So yes, onto the skills. But since you have nearly 100k DPS, you can use quite literally any, I repeat, quite literally any skill that uses weapon DPS to calculate its damage. But since not all are equal, I'm actually going to make a tier list for this. And I'm going to do this tier list thing in GIMP, also known as poor man's Photoshop, but that's kinda rude to say considering it's completely free and it can do generally everything that Photoshop can do, except you kinda need a little bit more patience and a few more clicks to do the same thing, but really, who cares? It's free and it's good enough. So yeah, anyway. Now let's look at the tiers I have prepared. First up is the mandatory tier, then extraordinary, then good, okay, bad choice, and haven't used. Because I might have a lot of hours in Torchlight 2, but even I have not explored every single possibility there is to explore. Now let's start with the Hunter skill tree, and let's start with Eviscerate. I would probably put it in the good category because it deals a decent amount of weapon DPS based damage and it generates a bit of charge. Now Howl, personally for me, is a bad choice because it debuffs your enemies, and you don't really need to debuff your enemies when you can just deal enough damage to not need to debuff them in the first place, so it's not really worth using. Raise is something I personally have chosen for my version of the build. It's also in the good tier because it deals 210% weapon DPS damage. It's completely insane. Flabbergastingly insane, actually. And it also gives you plus 75% damage for 2 seconds and it stacks, so yeah, it deals a lot of damage, but only against single targets, and that's what is keeping away the raise skill from being in the extraordinary tier. However, Wolf Strike is a different story because it deals a lot of damage. 144% weapon DPS is not a joke, and it also gives you a slight bit of mobility. I think it has 9 meters of dashing range, and that's generally good. Now, Battle Rage is something I have never used and never even considered using because it's just straight up a bad choice. And I'm going to skip a bit further forwards to the Shadow skill tree because Wolf Shade does basically the same thing as Battle Rage, except under different conditions. So, you spawn a wolf spirit that fights for you and heals you for a little bit of damage it deals, but it also gives you 75% to all your damage while it's active, as opposed to Battle Rage, which gives you plus, I think 10% damage per monster that's around you, and it has a higher potential than Wolf Shade, that's true, but it's also tied to more situational conditions, so the lesser but more reliable damage boost of Wolf Shade is more worth it in my opinion, though I haven't used it, but I would probably put it in the good tier if I had used it. Now back to the Hunter Tech 3, Ravage is something I have never used because it just seems bad, at least for me. I think it reduces armor, but as I said earlier, any sort of armor reduction or utility-based skill of that sorts is generally useless to me because why not just deal enough damage to not need such utility? Like, do you get my point? Now, the mandatory tier is something that contains both Bloodhunger and Executioner because these are awesome skills. And I would say that Rampage also belongs in the good tier. It's kinda situational because it doesn't trigger all the time, but I think it's useful, at least most of the time. Now, onto the Tundra skill 3. Frost Breath is something I haven't used, but it doesn't seem that bad, though, as I said, it's probably not something I personally would use. Stormclaw is okay. You have a 50% chance on every strike to basically cause a chain lightning effect, which deals a moderate amount of weapon DPS, which for this build is completely devastating, but what holds it back is that constant 50% chance to cause that chain lightning, which is just not good enough, and Wolfpack exists, and it makes Stormclaw kinda irrelevant, basically. Storm Hatchet is extraordinary. Do I need to say more? It's fucking Storm Hatchet, of course it's good. Northern Rage is something I have never used because it just seems awful for me. I don't know, man. Ice Shield is also extraordinary. It gives you basically a complete immunity to projectiles and it generates well, not that great amount of charge, but it's acceptable, I would say, but the immunity to projectiles is very nice. Cold Steel Mastery is the next mandatory tier skill I'm going to put here, and Shatterstorm is okay. It's not very useful when you can just dispose of your enemies nearly instantaneously, but I mean, it's useful some of the times. It's not completely useless, that's basically my point here. Rage Retaliation is good. It's not a bad choice like many would think because it's just funny when it gets activated. That's my whole point in using it. It's just funny to see enemies just disintegrating by just hitting you. However, the Rage Retaliation description is actually lying to you because it doesn't use weapon DPS, it uses weapon damage, which makes it more useful for two-handed weapons that deal higher damage than single-handed weapons. And you know what, I'm actually going to demonstrate just how correct my observations are, because you might probably not believe me, but indeed, 160% of your weapon's DPS is in fact incorrect. Let's now take a look at my primary weapon, the Clockmaster's Tooth. Let's simplify things and say that my damage per second is 100,000, so is my damage. In the previous clip you have seen that my enemies do 195,000 damage to themselves. But since Uh, these two numbers are pretty close to one another. You might wonder what the hell I'm talking about. It seems to be about right. Okay, I'm hearing you. However, let me switch to my Great Hammer, which I borrowed from my brainless Berserker. And now let's see these stats. 40,000 weapon DPS, less than half. Let's keep this in mind, because this is what the skill says it takes as a base for its calculations. And the weapon damage is 350,000. Now keep the numbers in mind. Alright, let's enter this new area. I'm just going to use Wolfpack to get rid of some of the enemies. You see? 550,000. That says more than enough, I believe. It doesn't deal damage based on your weapon DPS. It in fact deals damage based on your weapon damage. So yes. Like the brainless Berserker I showed in an earlier video. Now let's move on to the Shadow skill tree back again. Shadow of Burst is really something I probably would never use, I would say. I mean, the healing is nice, but it's basically the equivalent of Blood Hunger, and I mean, you could just trigger Blood Hunger anyway, so... And besides, Wolfpack, I'm just going to put it in the mandatory tier, because it can trigger Blood Hunger, so really there's no point in using Shadow Burst. Shadow Bind is something I never used, but it doesn't make sense for me to use anyway, so who cares. Savage Rush is, I would say, a bad choice, because I just don't see any situation where I would use it over... what's it called? Wolf Strike. It's just a personal thing. I never said that this is an objective list. It's completely biased, as you can see by me placing Rage Retaliation, a personal favorite skill of mine, to the good tier. Now, Chain Snare is something I never used because it seems nonsensical to use this. Metal Standard is extraordinary. The extra mana regeneration is why I use it, but the extra dodge chance is nice too, although that counteracts the Rage Retaliation's trigger chances, so yeah, that's, I would say, kinda sad, but I mean, I'll take not taking damage over Rage Retaliation any day. Frenzy Mastery is okay, but generally speaking, you don't really need it. Because your main weapon, the Clockmaster's Tooth, generates more than enough charge to trigger Frenzy, and you just don't need it to last that long, generally speaking, at least for this build. So yes, here is the tier list of the skills I would recommend, and yeah, that's basically it. Let's zoom in a slight bit. So yeah, here are the skills. Pick or choose whichever you want, but keep in mind that the lowest tier is the tier reserved for those skills I have never used ever in my entire career of Torchlight II, so this tier is just a huge question mark for me, so yeah. Alright, so in conclusion, this is an extraordinary build with extraordinary potential. Like, in my humble opinion, this probably might or might not be the single best Berserker build out there. Or at least a variant of this, because as you have seen in the skills section, you have options. Now, you might be wondering, since I have not put a lot of points into focus, in fact I have not put any points in focus at all, the mana consumption might be a bit of a challenge, but actually no. The max mana you have is quite low comparatively speaking, but that's not really an issue. After all, I put a gem into my necklace that ensures that I get at least a bit of mana regeneration. On top of that, I also have the mana regeneration scroll, and I can just put down battle standard, which also gives me some mana regeneration. That means it's not really an issue, but if by any chance you might run out of mana, just hit the enemies a couple times. That's what the rings are for. They give you a bit of mana steal, and with that attack rate, you just get all your mana back within a single second. And I might just exaggerate just a slight little bit. So yeah, this is actually a fantastic build. Like, I'm not going to lie, I'm proud of myself for spamming Wolfpack like 99% of other Berserker builds, just slightly more effectively. Anyway, thanks for paying attention. See you next time, whenever that might be.